Welcome to part 2 of Enlightenment in the Revolutionary World. Now we're going to talk about the Philosophes. So the 18th century, you see European society remained pretty hierarchical and monarchical. You see state religions still ruling the day, political wealth and power with a privileged few. Even entertainment would tend to be relegated to just the top, right? But by the 17th and 18th centuries, we start to see cracks in this edifice, right? For example, the Dutch Republic will be formed, right? This is a non-monarchical government, and it also is one that prompted religious toleration. The British Civil War that we've already talked about in the 17th century aired notions of equality, religious toleration, and popular sovereignty, right? The subsequent Glorious Revolution, the fall of the House of James II, right, in 1688 and 1689, brought about the idea of a constitutional government, even though albeit a constitutional monarchy, right? So all across Europe, you start seeing the middling orders growing wealthier and wealthier and more critical of the aristocratic privilege there at the top, and the state churches as well. So from this, we get the age of reason begins to trickle down through the corridors of power into a process that we refer to as the Enlightenment. Right? The Enlightenment is a time period from about 1720 to 1820, right? That 100-year period when intellectuals began to apply the methods of the scientific revolution to political, social, economic, philosophical, and even religious problems, right? Now, a thing to realize about these Enlightenment writers is that they're popularizers. They're not original thinkers. They are taking these ideas from the previous age and they're making them popular. They are spreading them amongst the kings, the nobles, the middling orders. They're reading these writings, and therefore the term philosophe was often the title given to these popularized writers. Now, many of these great ideas being popularized were English in origin. For example, an Irishman named John Toland is going to argue in 1696 in a book called Christianity Not Mysterious that nature itself is proof of God's existence. He's an early deist. He says that everything valid in religion can be reduced to reason, and if it cannot be reduced to reason, then it is pure nonsense, right? Now, in 1710, Bishop George Berkeley, another Irishman, is going to try and respond to rational skepticism in a book called Treatise Concerning the Principles of Human Knowledge with a theory of subjective idealism. Matter does not exist except where it is perceived in the mind, right? This allows him to put forth this idea of an overall controlling mind. In other words, the mind of God, right? On the opposite end of that spectrum would be David Hume, a skeptic and an atheist who in the 1750s argued in works so controversial that they were suppressed until 1779. He argued that reason and rational judgments were merely habitual associations to sensations and or experiences, right? In Germany, a man named Immanuel Kant agreed with Hume about the limitations of reason, but nonetheless sought absolute rules that everybody could assent to and follow, right? He even posited the idea that you could actually write a true history as long as you only included things that were undeniably factual. Of course, in reality, you can't. Now, the heart of the movement, though, was in France, right? And it's in around people like François-Marie Arouet, or better known as Voltaire. Voltaire lived from 1694 to 1778. As a young writer, he was actually thrown into the Bastille for 11 months for his satirical writings on the government. In 1726, he fled to England, where he'll live for the next 3 years, and he was overwhelmed by the intellectual freedom and the tolerance of different religious beliefs and the openness to political life. So in 1733, he wrote a book about his travels called Letters Concerning the English Nation. In this, Voltaire explained to Frenchmen and other Europeans Britain's concepts of constitutional monarchy, religious toleration, the scientific ideas of Newton, and the political philosophies of John Locke, right? The book was so controversial that it was banned in France, which of course made it a big hit. Everybody wanted to read this thing, right? Voltaire will spend the rest of his life attacking irrationality, intolerance, superstition in several essays and fables, of course, most famously in Candide. He also wrote a political dictionary, right? Now, his works led to charges of atheism and ultimately exile from France. But when you really look at his body of work, Voltaire, it seems that he didn't want to abolish monarchy or the aristocracy or even the church. He just wanted to reform it. Now, Diderot lived from 1713 to 1784, and he agreed with Voltaire in his ideas, in the ideas of needing to banish bigotry and superstition. He saw that the best way to do this was through the dissemination of scientific knowledge, right? To spread these popularized ideas, right? And so he did through the creation of the Encyclopedia, right? Diderot is going to edit a 28-volume encyclopedia from 1751 to 1772. Later, the publisher added 5 supplementary volumes and a 2-volume index. The thing's going to have 35 volumes and is the first example of what you would refer to, or what you would know as a modern encyclopedia. Charles Louis de Secondon de Baron de Montesquieu lived from 1689 to 1755. Montesquieu argued that the scientific study of man and his environment would yield the best possible government. And he wrote about this in 1748 in a book called The Spirit of the Laws. In this, he argued that the best governments mix separate and balanced elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy to varying degrees determined by the climate, right? These are ideas, obviously, that are going to be adopted by others, and we recognize this in our current system of government here in the United States. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who lived from 1712 to 1778, took these ideas even further, saying that people should be given a share of the power. He had grown up in Geneva, which had a republican form of government. As a young man, he had migrated to Paris right during the heart of the Enlightenment and met many of the great figures of the Enlightenment in France in the Parisian salons, right? He wrote a book called The Discourse on the Origins and Foundation of the Inequality of Mankind in 1755. In this book, he argues that while reason is good, the heart is a better guide to right conduct. And unlike Hobbes and even John Locke, he asserts that man was happiness in the state of nature, right? He said civilized society has a tendency to corrupt man. In Emile, which he wrote in 1762, he argues for an education system that emphasizes the freedom of expression and self-discovery. Also in 1662, he wrote The Social Contract. Rousseau contends that big states are naturally corrupt, and they corrupt the human spirit. And therefore, small states in which the citizens know each other are the best states in which to exist, like his hometown of Geneva, right? Further, Rousseau will argue that government policy should follow the general will of the people. These ideas, again, are going to later influence democratic theorists, and they're also going to, it's also going to influence fascists, including Adolf Hitler, right? His autobiography, Confessions, though written and circulated earlier, much before he died, emphasized emotion and moral ambiguity in adult life and therefore influenced the rise of Romanticism.